Welcome, everybody, to another edition of Coffee and Open Source, a place to meet some new friends, have some great conversations, and maybe learn something along the way. I'm your host, Isaac Levin. And if you're enjoying the interviews here, be sure to like, subscribe, follow wherever you are watching or listening. Also, if you're listening or know any folks that'd be interested in coming on the show and chatting, feel free to reach out to you on Twitter or Mastodon. My handle there is IsaacR11. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get to our guest. And I'm excited for my guest. My coffee's ready, and let's just get to the conversation. So my guest today is Kris Nóva. Kris, do you want to say hello? Introduce yourself.
Hey, how's it going? Nice to meet you. Finally, I guess this is remote face-to-face, so
Yeah.
super stoked to be here. So name is Kris Nóva. Most people call me Nova. Although a lot of people at work call me Kris. I encourage you to call me either one is fine, but you'll probably hear both. And yeah, right now I am working as a principal engineer at GitHub, and I certainly do plenty of open source antics on the side.
Well, that's exciting. I think that, some of the things I'm looking forward to the conversation because we were having a couple of interesting chats and you're like, let's talk about that on stream. Let's not talk about this right now. Let's talk about it on stream. But I'd like to get started the conversation with, talking about your tech origin story. So do you remember a point in time when you came across technology? Maybe it was when you were younger, maybe it was as you're getting a little bit older in high school or university, that you came across technology and you realized, like, this is what I like. I enjoy doing this. I want to work with technology as much as I possibly can.
Yeah, I think I have a lifetime of stories where one piece of technology has, stood out for some reason in my life or not. I think the one that like really hooked me professionally happened a little later in life, when I was in my late 20s. So I turned 40 next year. And so I've been around for a minute, and I want to say I was maybe 23 or 24, and this was and I was actually able to make my first small amount of money just doing some PHP work. And I think, looking back on the situation, the code I had written on the time, I can't even believe this thing was publicly available. I could probably break into the server in like 30 minutes now if I was running up against any of my old code. But I definitely think that was the time in my life, in my career, where I really got to feel like this like unfortunate hobby of mine. I've always been tinkering with computers and playing with different things and building things. I feel like this was the time where I actually felt like, hey, maybe I'm onto something. Maybe there's something more to this like weird, goofy, nerdy side of me than just like being like the nerd at the lunch table. Maybe
Sure.
I'll actually be able to like make something of myself here. And I think that is like kind of what kicked off my whole career, right? Like I decided to kind of like stop what I was focusing on and go focus on tech. And then fast forward, and now I'm a 2-time published author, and I've got some work on the kernel published, and in a couple of different master's theses floating around, and like I've made a small name for myself. And so it's exciting to feel like it all started with like some crappy PHP code 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think, to be fair, that crappy PHP code is probably not as bad as you think. I've seen some really terrible PHP code out there. Yeah, I think, one of the things that I'd love to kind of like, so you mentioned that you're a bit of a tinkerer.
Sure.
Were you a tinkerer, like even when you were a small child? And the reason why I ask is there's a lot of folks that I've had conversations with that, they took apart VCRs, they took apart remote control cars. Were you a tinkerer in that sense, or was it really when you got introduced to computers is when you really felt like tinkering was something that you could do, as much as possible?
So, I think I've always tinkered with things. I think that I could share was be like, I remember as a child, I used to tell people, if you ever make food out of the box, just based off of the directions on the side of the box, you're doing it wrong.
Sure.
And I was just always under this impression of like, everything in front of you is just a set of raw ingredients. And you should always kind of feel like inclined to make improvements or tinker or change or experiment with like whatever tools you have available to you. And so I think that philosophy, like that just dates back as early as I can remember, whether that was like playing with remote control cars or, the clothes I wore every day to school or, tinkering with computers or making macaroni and cheese out of the box. I was always inclined to kind of just like revisit the situation based off of like first principles and like the raw materials in front of me. And I think that like when I was young, I remember looking at a computer, and I think at the time it was like a Windows computer, and just thinking to myself, there's so much potential here, right? Whether it's just the software that the thing ships with or other software I could find, either on the internet, well, what was the internet at the time, which was a very far distant internet from what we see today, but like what I could find online or what I could find like at the local library. And I was bringing home books and finding the CD-ROMs from the books. And it always felt like there was just some assembly to do that hadn't been done yet. There was always some final frontier. There was always some pioneering yet to do. And that's been with me my whole life, as far back as I can remember.
That's awesome. And I've noticed that there's a trend with folks that are in tech, especially folks that are, I guess, more extroverted in tech, because I think it's fair to say that not everybody in tech loves to be in front of people and chatting and all that sort of stuff. But there is like there's area of folks in tech that just love to figure out how stuff is made. And it doesn't really matter what it is. Like you're talking about like your macaroni and cheese example, right? Like I've seen some very, very interesting macaroni and cheese that's just not out of the box. You can do all sorts of crazy things even after it's out of the box. So you mentioned that you kind of got started, is it safe to say like in web development, I guess you could say like PHP, maybe a little bit of HTML. Is that fair to say?
Well, so this is actually a really good topic to bring up, right? So I think the way I would frame it would be, my personal relationship with computers has long outlived my professional relationship with computers.
Sure.
And I think that like one of the things I still maintain, and this is a 20-year long like effort here, but like one of the things I still maintain is that like my personal relationship with a set of computers kind of lives alongside what I do professionally. And I had been working on just building websites and tinkering with computers. And like, I had a rough childhood, right? Like going through college, I had to put myself through college for the first few years before I graduated. And so like, I had gotten into some trouble at my university, and, there was a whole like long story of like me trying to figure out ways I could use computers to make my life more efficient. And I was doing things with computers personally that I felt were like, yeah, of course. Why wouldn't I, do my homework this way? This just makes sense, right? The computer gives us so much wonderful tools and opportunities we wouldn't have just like reading a boring old textbook. And then I think that like the PHP story I shared, that was the first time I made money with computers. And that really changed things for me, because that was the first time my professional relationship entered my life, right? And so I think that, looking back, like I do think that web development has, like, I've always kind of been working on the internet, building servers. I've always found that kind of stuff fun and exciting. But those are the first time I started to look at it and go, oh, this could actually replace my like staying up to 3 a.m. and being a bartender, right? This is like an actual like revenue stream for me in my life. And I think it really changed the way I looked at it. So anyway, that's a long way of saying web development was totally my first like big career move. And even at the time it was like $18 an hour. It like wasn't like a big career move. But yeah, like, and then, long before that, there had been, how do I go and like download textbooks, and how do I like go and grep for things and write little scripts and programs to help me like make it through college on a one person income and so forth.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's pretty interesting because of the fact that like you're using it to augment Kris, right? Like, yeah, I think that technology, when it's at its best, is just an extension of what our capabilities are as people. I don't think I've ever actually mentioned this story to folks on stream, but like I got in trouble at my university as well because I circumstantially was able to like get onto in my computer science curriculum, like the server for the instructors, so for the professors, and the long and short of it is that I had access to like all of the tests, all of the programming assignments, everything. And let's just say when I brought this up to the professors, they weren't very keen on it, and I got in trouble, right?
Yeah.
Because I was able to get into it. Like, okay, well, don't leave it just open as FTP. Problem solved. Anyway, the long and short of it is that, like, I think the idea of using technology to help better ourselves, like the idea of like writing scripts to do this, what are some of the things that you realized as you were going about this? Like, hey, maybe it's the bartending anecdote. I don't have to be up at 3 a.m. Like, what was like that first point in time when you realized? Do you remember like the exact scenario, or
Yep.
was it something just over the course of time?
No, so this is such a good question. So the way I would frame it would be like I learned at a very young age that computers gave me superpowers.
Sure.
Right. And like, what would normally take me, a day if I was measuring it in time, or, like 10 units of effort if I was measuring it in effort, right? I could cut that in half, or cut that in, quarters of like what it would normally take me if I could somehow use a computer. And I mean, that's DevOps, right? Like that's
Yeah.
server administration, right? Like
It's very much so.
That's the name of the game, and that core philosophy has always been there. So I think like when I think I was in high school at the time, and again, like, I had a rough childhood, like moved out at a young age. I had been on my own since 17, so like money was like I didn't really have a choice, right? Like I had to work. And so I was working as a, like, I didn't know this at the time because they were like very manipulative, but I was like working as a telemarketer that was kind of branded as like an AT&T like rep. And like, I don't know, they were like, we'll pay you $20 an hour. You answer the phone, you read off the page. And it was like very shady in hindsight. But looking back, like I was totally ripping people off, and they were just kind of lying to me so that I believed something, and they were lying to the customer so they believed something, and they were just hiring all these people to do like these shady things for them. And so anyway, one of the things I was doing was like I had to do all of these like real-time calculations, right? People would say like, oh, I'm spending this much on my phone bill, I'm spending this much on my internet, my cable, blah blah blah. And then there would be like some like small bit of calculus that would go into like how long have they had the subscription, how long have they been a customer, how much can we save. And there was like these sheets of like, here's the formula, and you take this number and you plug it in here and you do that, and then this is the bottom line and how much you can save the customer. And that was our job. We just sat there with these calculators. And anyway, I was like, I'm going to bring my TI-84. I'm going to write a little like program to actually ask me the questions. And I was just like, I was going through more calls than anyone else. And I think like this was totally the way I approached the world, right? Like if I could automate something, I totally would. And, like I remember like that worked out fine. They were happy. They made their money. In hindsight, I felt really guilty about what I did. And I remember like similar situation to you in school. I had that very same calculator I brought to school, and, we were taking our physics test or whatever. And I busted out my calculator and I was like, I have all these scripts that I wrote, and they do all my physics equations for me, and they give me my notes. And like, I totally used the tool to like its full capability. And then of course that was like, oh, you're cheating, right? Like you have to use the book, you have to show your work, you have to perform things our way. And it was mind-boggling to me, because like why would you not use this technology if it's readily available to you, right? Like why would you waste your time and your effort living your life this other way if you could totally come up with the same outcome in a fraction of the time with a fraction of the effort? And I think just like honestly, the world just wasn't ready for like computers at the time. Like people were just still like latching on to the old way of doing things.
Well, I think the themes that you're talking about, like, those problems are still existing. There's just there's different tools now, right? Like I very much remember getting in trouble for like being able to solve like my algebra 2 class, or my matrix class, whatever version that is, linear algebra. Like in getting a test done in like 15 minutes, because it's literally you put in all of the stuff into the TI-83 and you hit boom and it solves your matrix for you. Like, tools are great. And I see similar things you're talking about with like ChatGPT or the OpenAI stuff, right? It's like like formal education, or more, I guess more traditional or linear education, does not understand the idea of like, oh, like we can take tools and have those tools solve our problems. They're very much stuck in a way where it's like you have to do things like this, and this, right? And you're seeing all this pushback from formal education, like ChatGPT is going to ruin universities. It's going to do all these things. People can't write anymore because of AI assisted tools. And I mean, without getting too too foretelling, like what are some of the things that you see that like make our lives better that are in a similar vein, right? Like what can we do to help all these folks understand that these tools are for the benefit of society in a lot of cases instead of just tools to cheat or to beat the system or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think my big takeaway from a lifetime of this has been like, number one, people are afraid of change.
Sure.
Yeah, and I think that's to be expected, and I don't think there's any big surprises there. But I do feel like a lot of this is just the fear of the unknown, the uncertainty of tomorrow, and the impact, right? Like, what does this mean? Like, and with this uncertainty comes so much anxiety because it's like, am I going to lose my job? Are computers going to change the way that we do things? Am I going to go from making a 6-figure salary to basically being just another replaceable person, right? And it's like, well, I mean, in my opinion, that's actually more of a capitalism discussion than it is anything else. But like, yeah, you shouldn't be able to go bankrupt just because like the world like decides that like we now have some new technology that can help you do your job more efficiently. Like you and your family shouldn't lose healthcare because of it. But I do think that like when I look at technology, it just one theme that comes to mind, and I bring this up at work all the time, is like human beings love to get good at solving the wrong problems. So like I'll often use the example of like a luxury car. Like when you think of like a nice Mercedes or like a BMW, and it's got like the leather interior, it's super comfortable, it's quiet. You could just sit in the car for hours and hours and like just relax, and like the AC shine, it blows just right in your face, and it's got like the nice steering wheel. It's like we're getting good at sitting in traffic. That's the wrong problem to be solving as a society, right? Like I don't want to get better at doing the wrong thing. I actually think the conversation to be having is like, how do we get rid of traffic, like at large? And so like I see that same conversation, whether it's ChatGPT or like even Kubernetes or like even how we're building these large platforms or security. It's like we're going through all of these like gymnastics just to try to solve these problems that I'm just kind of like, maybe that's actually not the conversation to be having. Maybe the conversation to be having, zoom out and just say like, how can we kind of, again, go back to first principles, go back to the mac and cheese raw ingredients, right?
No, I totally agree. I think that you brought up like specifically Kubernetes, right? As there was a point in time where I think people were scared of Kubernetes, and then people were like, okay, everybody needs Kubernetes, even if you're building an internal line of business app with 5 users, it needs Kubernetes. And now we're kind of circling back where now everybody's scared of the potential overhead of Kubernetes, right? And I think I'd love to kind of get your thoughts, and this is hopping around a lot, but like the idea of distributed systems is not new, but it's just that now it's become a bit more, I guess, accessible might not be the right word, but that's the word that I'm thinking of right now. It's accessible for a lot of IT organizations. So like, I guess from your perspective as somebody who has been working in Kubernetes for some time, like how do we demystify a lot of what it's doing and kind of educate people on how if it's a tool to be used or a tool not to be used based on your use case, instead of just the everything's a nail when I'm a hammer sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Like I have gone 1.5 circles on Kubernetes at this point in my life. And I think that like the one thought that has always stuck with me that still continues to stick with me is like, it came from Borg. So like I look at it as like it originally came from Borg, which like Google is light years ahead of the rest of the industry anyway with how they treat their infrastructure, which is good. And I'm glad that they are. And I think that like, it's really just open source Borg with some marketing goo on top. And like, that's a very disrespectful statement, but I kind of mean it, right? Like I'm kind of like honest about it. And I think that when I look at, people who are approaching it, it's like, it's solving the distributed scheduler problem. And I really think that like, you have to be in the infrastructure mindset for it to make sense. And what I mean by that is like, I wrote a book called Cloud Native Infrastructure. And I think that like in hindsight, I probably would have like reframed the first initial chapters. But like, at the time, this was the best thing that we had, which was like this idea that like the cloud is your infrastructure. And I think there's some like consequences of like schlepping all of your infrastructure out to a corporation because you know what they're going to do with it at the end of the day. But like in hindsight, if you're not building a service that's kind of like for the public good, where the public is either the general public or like at your corporation, you're not really in an infrastructure mindset.
Yeah.
And so like when I look at people who use Kubernetes as like a delivery vehicle, or I look at people who use it as like an application encapsulation vehicle, I'm kind of like, you're not really using it for like these like core services that you want to like make a generic transparent service across your organization, whatever your organization may be. So like a good example of this is there's like a couple of white papers that have come out of Google, like one of which is like the Zanzibar paper. There's another one about like how Google like offers like just different metrics for every application running in the entire corporation, right? And so like Kubernetes is a good vehicle for those discussions. Like how do we make it such that every application has X, Y, and Z, whether it's observability or monitoring or access to logging or security checks, or even we can just like take it and make some basic guarantees about how it manages persistent storage. So I think that those are the really helpful conversations to be having, but I don't know. I'm just like, I see people like you said, you know, when you're a hammer, everything's a nail, like just like using it for a lot of like very strange things. To me, that's just like more indicative that like there's just more gaps in the space than we think, and Kubernetes is just the closest thing to fill those gaps today. So like it's kind of nice because at least I feel like robots are going to take over the world.
Sure. I mean, yeah, it's funny. Like, I feel like there was a meme I saw at some point where it's like robots are never going to take over the world because somebody needs to manage Kubernetes. Right.
Sure.
So, which I thought, and I mean, I've talked to Joe Beta on this show, and I think a lot of the things that he said is not any different than what you're saying. Right. Like, and I think it goes to like what good solutioning actually is, right? It's looking at the problem and it's like, do you need to unwind all of space and time to ship your app? The question probably is no. You know, I think just the fact that there's so many cloud native, and I'm using quotes, people in the future who are listening to this aren't seeing my air quotes, but like the amount of companies that are cloud native that are basically wrappers for Kubernetes. Like, you know, and they're selling some SaaS service, which is literally just Kubernetes as a service. Like, if that exists, the question then becomes, do those folks' customers, do they actually need Kubernetes at all? No, not really, probably not, but they're being marketed that they need Kubernetes. And it's, I mean, again, it's not a new problem. We've been talking about distributed computing for 30 years, right? I think one thing that's also really interesting, you know, thinking about your backstory is like, you know, you mentioned a bit earlier, like contributing to the Linux kernel, right?
Sure.
And I'd like to kind of go back in the career or the life, you know, progression of Kris. Like, at what point in time did you realize that like that level was interesting to you? Because obviously you're at this, you know, web developer and, you know, PHP, doing web stuff, maybe messing around with servers as a necessity because you need to be able to stand up your servers and things like that. But at some particular point in time, you got really interested into Linux, right?
Yeah. I mean, I still am, right? Like I still work on the kernel.
Yep.
I don't contribute upstream anymore. And really like, I think that's kind of a good thing. Like Linux, I don't know. We could spend hours talking about my relationship with Linux. Maybe we could do that someday. But when I think about it, I really think that like I've always been infatuated with like going deeper down the rabbit hole, I guess you could say. And the kernel was kind of always this like black box in my mind. It was kind of this just like, how does it work? What does it do? And I knew somewhere that like my motherboard had to interface with the like my mouse, right? Like I knew there was something somewhere, and there was nothing in computers I wasn't able to figure out or hack effectively at the end of the day. And so the kernel kind of always kept drawing me closer and closer to it throughout my career, just because I didn't understand it. And like now that I've, you know, been working, you know, alongside it, in it, around it, against it, for it, you know, FreeBSD, et cetera, you know, building Docker containers, building my own container runtime, writing eBPF probes, writing kernel modules, working in security, et cetera. Like it feels like, I think it actually is more important to society from like a political and social standpoint than I actually think the technology is anything all too exciting. Like the kernel's kind of boring. Like it does some cool things with like how we expose like packets and like how we structure the different subsystems and the guarantees it makes. And like some of like, I feel like there's kernel infrastructure now. There's like certain parts of the code that we expose to like in other subsystems in the kernel that like make your life more convenient as an engineer. But like, I don't really think like if you go and you do any research on like microkernels or like why Solaris came to be or like how we do heap memory management in FreeBSD, like Linux is kind of boring and I kind of love it. And so like but like the socioeconomic impact of having all these hardware providers come together and agree, I mean that's cool. That's a conversation that still keeps me like excited about the kernel at the end of the day, right? Like here's a good example. So like the Apple Silicon M1 that just came out.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So like Hector and the folks at Asahi, they're all like porting, they're working on Linux drivers and sound drivers, and they're actually like taking the kernel, and like they ran into some page cache size issues. They had to go like contribute to the kernel. But like the fact that they have a place to do it, and that now everything in the world, whether it's Docker or Kubernetes or a regular old ELF binary or the ls command, can now go run on this new piece of hardware that didn't even exist when the kernel first started. Like that's cool. And I think that there's just huge monolithic implications of that keep drawing me back to that like single small thing at the core of everything that we work on. I don't know.
No, I mean, all I took from that is that Kris Nóva said that Linux is boring and she loves it, right? Like, I think that's, I
guess, I don't know.
No, but I obviously, all jokes aside, like, I mean, I don't think everything needs to be shiny and, not everything needs to be shiny. I think that's the best way to phrase it, right? Some things, primitives, are called primitives, not because they're exciting, but because they're essential, right? But I at some point in time, I think you decided, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, but you decided that like you found like this happy medium between working on the web and distributed systems and all this stuff, but at the same time, figuring out the best ways to be efficient with the primitives, right?
Yeah.
Like, and I guess maybe to unravel a little bit of your psyche to an extent, like, why do you think that is? Why do you think that you kind of like this weird cross section between, to a lot of folks, cutting edge, terrifying new change and something that's been stable for 40, 50 years?
At the end of the day, I'm a builder.
Sure.
And I think, there's a ton of implications with what that statement means.
Mm-hmm.
But I think like, because I'm a builder, I think we can always build new, effective, efficient things, right?
Yep.
So I look at whether it's Linux or Kubernetes or like my new project Aurae that I started, or any of the things I do at GitHub. There's always an opportunity to build something better. And whatever better means is subject to change, right? Like capitalism is going to say like whatever we can sell is better, right? And then the computer scientist is going to say, well, whatever runs, at a lower overhead and actually is more performant at runtime is better. And, the security engineer is going to say whatever's hardest to break into is better. And so I think that like, there's a million different ways to have any discussion. There's a lifetime of perspectives, and every piece of software we build is multifaceted at the end of the day, which is why like I think things like Kubernetes and Linux is so exciting. And so like as a builder, I'm just like always fascinated with like how we can take these same things and then we look at them through a new lens, and all of a sudden it's like a new dimension of the problem that I never thought of before. And like that's exciting to me. And I have a neurosis, I have ADHD, I follow the dopamine like anyone else. So like, at the end of the day, when somebody's like, hey, we can lock this down and make it more secure, I'm like, heck yeah, let's do it. And it just might be like the cat command or something boring, but like if it seems like it's an exciting path to go down, and I'm always happy to entertain it.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty fascinating. I also like, the idea of chasing the dopamine is an interesting way to phrase it too, because I think there are some folks in tech, I think you and me are probably included in it in some way. It's like always be learning. And I think that really kind of drives this idea of wanting to figure out how to fix things, wanting to figure out what's the new thing on the horizon that I should be learning. What are some of the things that you think about? And we can talk about Aurae a little bit. We can talk about maybe some of the things that you're doing that you can talk about at GitHub. But like, what are some of the things that you see out on the horizon that are like, that really gets you excited? Like the things that you wake up and you're like, okay, this is the problem that I'm going to try to solve today.
Yeah, so I'll give you high level answers on both.
Sure.
So like we'll start with GitHub. So this one's exciting. So I sit as a principal engineer at GitHub, and I am all over the place. I was working on the databases the other day, and we had this. I'm sure there's a couple of folks listening right now who were impacted by this, but like we had this like Git SHA confusion happen the other day in production where we like rolled out some changes, and all of a sudden like our SHA that we were returning for like downloaded archives changed. So we like broke the internet's build system for like, a good couple of hours. And so like I was, looped into that, and I learned more about how we operate Git at scale. And it's like, oh
Sure.
yeah, the Git and GitHub actually means something. We have thousands of servers that run Git on the back end. And like, of course you do, like, but like to go and kind of dig into that and like, get into the implementation details is exciting. So like the thing that I've kind of said for myself at GitHub is, I read the Hacker News articles, right? I'm very new to the company. I know people have opinions. I know
Sure.
people are like, oh, it's suffering. The availability isn't there, or like, it's doing really great today, or whatever. Like and maybe this is just me, but I kind of want to make GitHub just boring again, right? Like I just want it to just be like, I just want it to be on. I want our servers to work. I want them to work well, and I just like really have always loved GitHub in general. And so I think that's kind of like my self mission is just like, how do I keep us scaling and growing to the future as a principal engineer and helping us just build more resilient, more available systems in the back end? And like, I don't know, like if I get to like change some of the perception of that, like that seems like a cool thing to work on. So, and then of course there's a ton of detail, right? There's a lot of things to work on there, everything from Kubernetes to the Ruby monolith to MySQL on the back end and all kinds of stuff. So anyway, that's GitHub. As far
Sure.
as Aurae is concerned, I think that like the real thing that I'm really excited about is like, again, if you haven't picked it up already, like I like boring systems.
I mean, there's a trend here. Yeah, I've used the word boring, I
Yeah,
think, than any other guest I've ever had on the show, which is cool.
I love it. I want to make the node boring, and I hope that Aura can do that. So when I look at Kubernetes, I look at like the original problems it was trying to solve, which is basically like distributed scheduling, right? We have a group of people. We want them to deploy their app in a uniform way so that we can manage it at scale. And we want to be able to like invest into all of these features that, support and sit alongside an app, whether that's logging or monitoring or runtime availability metrics or SLO, or there's a whole lifetime of like platform level things that we effectively want to offer like our app teams. And the more successful we are, the more
Sure.
app teams we have and the more services we need to build. But like that control plane conversation was sort of like the natural evolution of solving that problem. And we took those needs and we worked backwards from there. And we said, okay, let's take everything that we have, like we have systemd and we have Linux and we have Docker and we have these networking primitives, and we're going to go like group them all together and build this like Kubernetes, like interdependent, choreographed, whatever thing that we have today. And like, I'm very happy we went down that rabbit hole, and we were very successful, in my opinion, of doing that. In hindsight, looking back, what are the core needs of the system? What really do we need to expose to the control plane? There's a lot of complexity that's kind of just operating and doing a few basic things. So I think Aura is my response at saying like, okay, now that we know what we need and we've worked backwards and we, cobbled all these tools together, let's just simplify that and create like one really efficient tool that gives us exactly what we need and is built specifically and tailor-made just for this problem. So whether it's Kubernetes or Mesos or any distributed runtime, my hope is that Aura becomes like the de facto way to execute any process on a given piece of hardware. And that's a bold statement to make, but hopefully, if I'm going to dedicate the rest of my career to some open source project, this is the one, right? And I had some big decisions to make. What container runtime do we want to use? What language do we write it in? There was like a lot to unpack here. And so anyway, that's where I am with Aura today. And there's a lifetime of work to go into that.
Yeah, I mean, and this is maybe so a little bit of backstory. I have ADHD as well, and like I hear a couple of things that you're saying, and hear you say ADHD, and I'm like, okay, well that sounds terrifying to me. Like the idea of working on the same thing forever, right? Is it because in your opinion there are enough problems to solve to never get stagnant or complacent with the work that you're doing? Because that's been my biggest issue with open source projects in general, is that even though they live forever, they do kind of have a life, right? A life in your mind. And then it's that you need to effectively figure out a way to grow past that. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on what is it specifically? Is it the things we were talking about a bit earlier, like that these are the things that you really see as solving problems long term? I kind of rambled for a bit, but I hope you're kind of getting where I'm going from here. I'm curious in general about like what are the problems that you think are always going to need to be solved, and why can you make a bold statement like this is something that I want to work on forever, which I guess to me sounds a bit terrifying.
It's a huge scope. So like just in general, like the phrase like I want to be the de facto execution engine for every distributed
Yep.
system I would potentially build in the future. That's huge, right?
Yeah.
That's like saying
Yeah.
like I want to be the auto manufacturer for all the things,
Yeah.
right? Like that's a huge fucking statement.
Yep.
Sorry, I don't know if I can swear here.
No, please go ahead.
But I mean, like, and like, I think you point in that direction. That's your North Star vision. And then, you know, if you get 20, 30, 40% of whatever, like, hey, that's great. We'll take it. And so when I look at the scope of it, I think what I remind myself is these continued conversations that keep popping up. You know, whether they're in my career or I'm helping a friend, or, you know, in the past, I've like worked with customers when I've sold Kubernetes and sold other like cloud services in the past. The conversation is like, hey, when is X, Y, and Z going to be ready? Or
Yeah.
like X, Y, and Z is coming. Or we can't build X, Y, and Z for another, 2 years because it's a quarter's worth of work, which in
Yes.
engineering, a quarter's worth of work means it's a year's worth of work, right? Like, and so I think that all of these conversations keep popping up. And I'm kind of doing the, like, I don't want to get good at sitting in traffic thing where I like zoom out and like I look at the kind of core use case and I'm like, it really shouldn't take this long to instrument an application with an eBPF probe that just like, surfaces some basic information. Like the technology is there.
Yep.
There's nothing in my mind from a technical sense that's going to prevent anybody from building this thing tomorrow other than just sitting down and doing the thing.
Yeah.
And so that kind of has led me to this like core belief that like most of the problems we're solving today is just like working backwards around other problems. And it's not actually like how do we go and actually just do the one thing we're trying to solve today. So I guess my hope is like by bringing like this better set of controls lower in the stack, I can simplify these higher order conversations in the future. So like a good example is like if I can make it easier for you to instrument a single PID at runtime, my hope is that these conversations about how long does it take for us to get like, runtime performance metrics about our app, or how long does it take for us to get better security controls about our app, or how long does it take for us to like have better guarantees about the networking for our application. It's like my hope is that those conversations go from it'll be ready in 2 years to like, cool, we'll roll this out, next month or something, or like we actually have like a means to an ends for accomplishing this.
Yeah, and I love to kind of get your thoughts too, like in the same, vein of like building community around open source, right? Because
Sure.
I while you were chatting, I just briefly went and looked at like the Aurae, like some of the stats on GitHub, right? Like you have a lot of folks that see this as a viable solution to a problem, right? And I think initially, like, what was your, I guess, were you always thinking when you were thinking about building this that this is something that once people see it, it's going to take off, it's going to be enormous? Like you had that vision initially? Or were you in, I guess, the other way of open source was like, I'm going to build this because I'm interested in it and I want to see where it comes out of it. And then people organically came to it. Like, do you recall when you were first sort of thinking about tinkering with it, like what the eventual outcome was going to be?
I mean, like, I definitely didn't want it to be big. Like, that was never, It was never a marketing gimmick or anything. Like, I like, there's nothing in this for me to sell. Like, personally, from like an investor's perspective, I do investing as well. I don't think there's any fucking money here, right? Like, I'll just be really candid about it. Like, I don't think selling like a node level runtime that runs as a PID 1 is actually going to make all too terribly much money. And so like some people disagree with me. I've talked with some CEOs from some well-known infrastructure companies that I know for a fact you and people listening to this stream have heard of, who strongly disagree with me on that statement.
Sure.
And but like it's open source not because I wanted it to be big, or not because I wanted the accolades or the GitHub stars or anything like that.
Yeah.
Honestly, it's open source because it's my lifetime project,
Yeah.
right? Like I don't know where I'm going to be working in 10 years.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't know who's going to be around or who I'm going to be working with or what the state of the industry is going to be in 10 years. So like giving it to the Nivenly Foundation and building an open source project with an Apache 2 license was actually like a means to an ends of making it such that I would be able to contribute to this thing despite where my career went.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think that like all of a sudden we had emails showing up in the inbox like, hey, the folks at Google want to sign the CLA. And it's just like, oh, other people clearly see the outcomes here and the potential here. And so that was exciting. But even now, like I'll go talk to people about it, and like half the time people's like jaws drop and they're like, oh my gosh, when is this thing going to be done? It's going to solve all my problems.
Yeah.
And the other half of the time people scratch their head and they're just like, I don't get it. Right.
Sure.
And I think that those implications are so like second and third degrees off of where we are today that like, if you're a dreamer, you might be able to see the implications of it, but like, who knows what it's actually going to go and do.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point about technology in general. There's going to be people who are believers and non-believers, right? Not to attach to like any sort of like deity sort of thing, but I think at the end of the day, like it's about, does this solve a need that I see my customers or me internally, my internal customers having, right? And if you're having folks like, you know, you mentioned Google reach out to you, like that only shows that you're doing something right. Not everything right, probably, but something right. And that's great. That's what builds open source community. And like looking at contributors you have, again, vanity metrics, whatever they are, like you're not alone in this decision, right? Or in this discussion. I'd like to kind of talk to, you know, about programming languages. And this is because obviously you got started, you know, we talked about it a bit earlier, the PHP, the web space, and you've made this transition into a bit lower level, right? Like Rust, or, you know, Go is not really low level, but to an extent Go, like these, I guess if you were to talk to somebody who's been in tech for a while, these newfangled languages I keep hearing about, right? Like, so at what point in time did you decide, like, these technologies they're growing adoption, I want to build on them?
Oh man, that is, how do I even begin to answer that? So they say that you're supposed to answer all these questions in 3 sentences or less. So
Who
I'll
says
try.
that? Who says that?
I mean,
no,
they say
no
like,
one with ADHD can answer a question in 3 sentences. I'm sorry, that's
well,
not yeah. Go ahead.
We'll see
Let's see what you
do.
try. Yeah.
Okay, good. So I think, you know, my read on your question was, you know, why did you write Aurae and Rust? And what do I think about languages in general and building on top of some of these lower level ones? I am a strong believer in pragmatic programming. That's my first sentence. My second sentence is I believe that you can be successful no matter what language you write it in. And the third one is I chose Rust specifically for memory management and for macros. Those were the two big, and I gave a whole talk. So here's my ADHD, and I gave a big whole talk on this at FOSDEM, where, you know, we talked about like, you know, what I use Rust macros for, or what the project uses Rust macros for, and, you know, why memory management is important. And that is kind of has to do with like the runtime architecture and where we put different parts of the program as it correlates to your application with regard to security and things like that. But I mean, you know, I guess probably a more important question that I get asked often is like, Nova, what do you like more, Go or Rust? And I think, you know, coming from Kubernetes, Go was my first big compiled language to write professionally. So like, I obviously know C and C++, but that was like very, you know, go write an algorithm in C and pass your coding test. And then like, you don't, you know, you don't ever write it professionally. Like
build an
ETM.
That was my first assignment in C ever. Build an ATM.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
Next song, one song in the bank, right? Like that was pretty much it. But I mean, Go was like, you know, I was cranking out PRs in Go, right? Like I was contributing in Go. I was following along with the language. I was showing up to the events. I was reading the blogs, you know, making friends who were at the Go team. Like Go was alive. It was real. I could go and interact with it. And I just never really felt that same way about C or C++. You know, it was kind of before my time, I guess. And so, like making the decision to write Aura in Rust, it took some time. So if you go to github.com/Aura runtime/ I think it's Aura-legacy, I had written most of this in Go originally. And I think it's just because that's just what I'm familiar with. Like Go's my comfort food of programming languages, right? Like you can't go wrong with like a good main function and like a Cobra command line implementation and just like, /pkg, right? Like I know people right now watching here, it's like, amen, right? Like this is like what that's what they're used to. And that's what I wrote because it was again, like it was just safe, and psychologically I didn't have to much to think about. And I just got to kind of do the Bob Ross thing and just go and just follow the dopamine and just paint my happy trees and build what I wanted to build and just like do the thing. And then took a step back from it and looked at it and said, cool, I know what I want to do now. And Rust gives me like an opportunity to take advantage of macros and generate a bunch of code, which is a huge thing we needed to do in Kubernetes that I feel like is still an opportunity for improvement. And it also gave us the memory safety and access to all the native C bindings that we didn't get in Go. So I do think Rust was like a very easy decision to make for Aura. But, building on top of any of these, I don't know. I mean, what I said, you can be successful no matter what language you write. And I don't really have like one holy opinion over the other. I write, but we write Ruby at GitHub, right? Like I write Ruby. Like it doesn't matter. It's all funny money at the end of the day.
Sure. But could you still like throw together some really adequate PHP in a pinch?
Yeah, I think I could. My experience with PHP is like, so I worked on PHP 7. So I contributed to the C code for PHP 7 when we first got like method signatures, and like that was a whole thing. But like the only thing I really do with PHP anymore is this is going to show like what I do for my free time when I'm stressed. I do a lot of like hack the box pen testing when nobody's watching. Sure. So I like break into computers to help me with my anxiety. PHP is a great language to learn if you're going to be like popping shells in people's computers and stuff like that. So I definitely am familiar with like how PHP servers work and how to like take advantage of some of the illustrious features of the PHP runtime.
Yeah, and the reason why I ask is I think everybody kind of has like the language. I guess you kind of mentioned it with Go, right? Like the language that I feel most comfortable in. It's my safe space. If I need to, somebody comes up to you and says, "Hey Nova, I want you to build a little thing," and you're going to go to Go. Goodness gracious, and build something in Go. You're not going to choose Rust, or maybe you will, depending on the use case, but like more than likely it's going to be Go, right? Is that fair to say?
I mean, I think so. I think like, and my first big statement here was like, I believe in pragmatic programming.
Yep.
So like, I would say in my whole career, of doing this thing, working professionally with computers for, 15 years or however long it's been, I would say that maybe 3 times in my whole career, I've actually been able to sit down in front of a problem and go, what's the right programming language to build this in?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think Aura is one of those 3 situations, right? And like, I very deliberately carved that out for myself. Like I invented that from scratch just so I could have that conversation for the first time. But like, other than that, like, 99% of my work is just walking up to something that like, the team already knows Java, or it's already written in Go, like, or it's already written in X, Y, or Z. And so like you kind of just learn to be like useful with whatever tools you have available. And so like, I don't know, like I think people should be like comfortable with any language. I remember my piano teacher used to tell me like, be at ease in all keys, meaning like you should just be able to sit down in front of a piano and play any song in any key at any time. I feel the same way about programming language. Like you should be able to sit down and make a meaningful contribution in, pretty much any language that is in your vicinity in your life.
Yeah. That's great. I think, and I'll be the first to say, my running joke on this show is that I've tried to learn Go 15 times because I've never gotten so excited about it that I've like wanted to build anything more than like the silly forms over data or the silly pragmatic example, like practical example. But I think that you got me a bit, now I need to, if you say Go is your go-to, I need to give it one more shot. So I'll definitely look to try it for the 16th time, all jokes aside.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that I would love to talk about as well, and we were talking about a little bit before we got started, it's top of mind to me as somebody who is trying to navigate the ever changing social media and tech landscape, right?
Sure.
And I think one thing that's very interesting to me, specifically in preparing to talk to you, is, obviously for folks who might not know, Nova's a great advocate for Mastodon. And, they have their reasons for wanting to do that. And I'd love to kind of get your thoughts on, what does a transition look like for folks going from Twitter to Mastodon? Or is it simply like, look, Twitter is this, Mastodon is this, I prefer Mastodon, and let's party there because I feel like I'm a better person there. I'd love to kind of get your thoughts about this landscape in general, if you don't mind.
Yeah, there's a lot to say.
Sure.
Let's start off by saying, similar to the programming language conversation we just had, where it's like, there's only been a few times where I actually get to sit down and pick a programming language.
Mm-hmm.
My number one thing I would say to anybody who's in the process of switching to Mastodon, or is considering, or maybe they just did, or it's new to everyone.
Yeah.
At some point, even if you've been using it for several years, it's still relatively new. My advice would be, approach it like you kind of approach the programming language conversation. Sit down and ask yourself what you want out of it. I think Twitter does a really good job at kind of establishing this like social precedent of like, how does the world perceive you?
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people get really, really caught up into how they feel like the world perceives them on Twitter.
Mm.
And I feel like Mastodon gives you an opportunity to kind of break free of that if you really want to. So if you can spend maybe 30 minutes and just sit down, grab a piece of paper, whatever you want to do, and just ask yourself, like, what do I want out of social media for me?
Yeah.
Right? If I could wave a magic wand, no matter how irrational it may be, what would make sense for me and my needs? And then work back from there with Mastodon. That's the relationship I would encourage people to kind of establish early on. Because frankly, it's different than Twitter, right?
Yep.
I think Twitter kind of reinforced this like invisible, like closed group of elite decision makers that we call a corporation that you and I
Sure.
will never have access to. And that's not Mastodon. There's no cordoned off group of, Elon Musk cronies that like you have to know somebody to go talk to so you get a little check mark by your name, right? It's open source. Like if you have a problem, like roll up your sleeve, pull requests accepted, open up a GitHub issue, like go to Discord, do what you're going to do. Everybody runs their server a little differently, but like that separation is no longer there. And so I think, if you are making a transition, one of the most powerful things you could do for your own needs is just identify what it is you're looking for and establish that early.
Yeah, I think that's pretty succinct way to think about it. I think, to kind of, I guess, break apart one of the things that I'm curious about in general about this is like I live two lives on Twitter, and I think a lot of people typically do, at least that they're in the tech space. They have, like all the stuff that I care about, like from a personal standpoint, and then stuff I care about from a work standpoint, and then there's probably a healthy intersection between the two. And I think one of the big things that I've seen as I've slowly kind of done more and more on Mastodon is that it's far more with and this is probably intentional. The intended audience is very much people who have a larger intersection of those two things. Like the technology part of their work or part of their life from a personal work standpoint, the Venn diagram is a bit smaller. And I think, what is the magic sauce to, obviously for Mastodon to be something that, I guess, maybe to take a step back, is the goal of Mastodon to replace Twitter, or is it to be a better space for people in the tech community to have conversations together?
So I don't know. So like, let me start off by saying, like, of all the open source projects I've contributed to, Go, FreeBSD, Terraform, Kubernetes, Docker, right? I've contributed to most of these household names people use every day. And in some cases, like Aurae, I've even started my own. I have never written a line of code for Mastodon. I know nothing about how it operates. I couldn't even tell you what license it has. I am purely an operator of Mastodon that totally happened by like, I never sat down and said, I want to go have a Mastodon instance with 50,000 people on it. I think
Sure.
like I set up a Mastodon instance for me and my buddies, and then 50,000 people were like, I trust Nova Pants. That's what my wife calls me. And I'm going to go, join her server. And I'm going to go like decide to be like in her little group of friends. And that quickly grew to 50,000 people overnight. Well, over 30 days, but like, I mean, you get the idea.
Yep.
So I don't know what Mastodon intends to be. I can't speak on the direction of the project at large. I can tell you what I want the Fediverse to be and what I want out of the Fediverse. And I think that when I look at federated technologies in general, I think of email, think of SMTP, I think of RSS, I think of all of these like pieces of technology that allow you to interact with other people throughout the world that you don't all have to log into the same like .com website to go and access. And so one of the implications of that is like you are no longer bound to a corporation, which what do we know about capitalism and corporations is that they're going to pick profit at the end of the day at all costs, and they have no obligation to society on an ethical front. And so like corporations are going to do what corporations have always done. Right? It would be foolish to think they're going to do anything else, and they're going to prioritize profit, which means Twitter as a corporation is going to pick ads and marketing and product delivery placement in favor of your mental health. And they're going to exploit you for everything they can, because that's just how these things tend to happen. So when I look at Mastodon, I look at it as like a means to an end for us to actually have a social media network that doesn't involve like one of these profit-focused corporations that has to come up with a way of actually managing how they're going to make money and make some billionaire richer and richer every day. Like we certainly don't want to get rich off of Hackaderm as much as we just want a safe place to share puppy pictures that we don't feel like our data is going to get sold, right? So that's my hope for what it's worth.
No, I mean, I think that's valid. And I think, and maybe this is me just thinking just too binary, like it's either got to be this or that. But like I see at least initially, and maybe even 5 years, it might be like this or it might be different. But there's just a lot of, I guess, personas that I don't think Mastodon will ever cater to, right? Like Associated Press or CNN or ESPN or like these major entities. I don't think there's enough in it for them right now, and maybe it is in the future, to use some distributed social network, right? Until there's lots and lots of people. And I think we're solving that slowly but surely in one particular sector, right? I think one thing that's also interesting, I'd love to get your thoughts too, is like, a lot of folks, they post to both, right?
Sure.
And I think that's very, very interesting to me, because you're like, it seems to me like you've gone all in. And I think, back to your maybe pragmatic social media platform statements you made, like at some point in time, if you want to be on Mastodon, you just slowly move off of Twitter. But I'd like to get your thoughts on, like, if you're a content creator and your goal is to get as much visibility on your content as possible. Maybe it makes you money. Maybe you care about what people think about you on social media, what have you, right? What is the advantage of posting to Mastodon? Is it access to those people? Is it some of the things you mentioned, talking about the community and not having your persona being sold and things like that? Or is it something else?
I mean, so like you actually asked a really good question, and I really appreciate the fact that you like made it a point to say if you're a content creator and your goal is to grow your audience, right? Because that changes the conversation, right? And I think most of the time the conversation I have is step one, identify your goal and what you want out of Twitter. And as it turns out, most folks are like, well, I just want a place to vent, or I just want a place to throw shade at my boss, or I just want a place to follow along with news and offer my like shitty opinion from time to time, or, whatever. But like we're having a different conversation when we're talking about being a content creator with growing your audience. And so like when I think of being a content creator, I think of people like, I'll give you an example. Lana Lux, right? She's a Twitch streamer. She's an indie game developer, and she has decided to become a completely self-sufficient video game engineer, and she builds her own game. She does marketing. There's a whole thing, and she's been doing the whole thing live on Twitch, right? Twitter is an opportunity for her to make a salary, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's what she's trying to do with her career. So like it's very hard to be critical of somebody who is using it as like a means of like growing their audience and like as a marketing vehicle for like their thing that they're trying to build. So I think that like if your goal is to grow your audience and you're an influencer or content creator or whatever you want to say, I think Twitter is fine. And I think that like you're definitely going to get a different crowd there. And I think that one of the most important lessons I've ever learned in, developer advocacy or selling things or just, advocating for technology in general is know your audience.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I think that the audience on Mastodon is different. So the
Yep.
same tips and tricks and gimmicks that you put on Twitter that are going to get you clicks and likes and followers aren't going to work on Mastodon. So, I mean,
Yep.
there is a Venn diagram. There's going to be some overlap, but like, I definitely think when I think of Mastodon, I think of these are the tinkerers, these are the scientists, these are the do-it-yourselfers. And when I think of Twitter, I think of these are consumers. These are people who just kind of want to be that. They're either consumers or they're people who are, selling a service in which they hope people will consume. And so I think that that's like a little more transactional at the end of the
Sure.
day. Like, and that's, keep that in mind and cast your wording, your language, and your message accordingly, right? The people there just want information presented to them in a different way.
Yeah. And I think the
Right.
big
Like,
thing, sorry, go ahead, finish up.
oh yeah, sure. No, I was just going to say this kind of goes back to like how you describe a piece of open source software. So like, I think the people on Mastodon want to know how it works. The people on Twitter want to know what it does.
That's actually not actually. That's very poignant. Like I never thought about it like that. Like
Right. Like,
it's
like
yeah.
people on Mastodon want to know how Kubernetes works. They want to know how does the SSH tunnel work. They want to know how does the YAML get rendered. They want to know how does the runtime work. They want to know how it works.
Mm-hmm.
People on Twitter want to know what does it do? What does it solve?
Yeah. No,
Like how does
that's
this make me money? Yeah, I don't know. That's just
no,
like
that's
the
great. I
paradigm.
mean, I've never had it phrased like that, and I think to go back to kind of the theme of the whole thing, the whole discussion is like look at the problem you're trying to solve, and then pick the solution that solves your problem, whatever your problem is, whether it be programming languages or different software or what have you, right? I think that's very poignant. And I want to thank you for that because I've never heard anybody say it as simply as that. And it makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
So yeah, so we're at the end of time, and Kris, I wanted to thank you so much for hopping on the show and chatting with us. And I think as we wrap up, I love to ask my guest one final question, and it's the hardest question, so I apologize. And that the question is, if you could think of technology, open source, the community around it, but you only had one word to describe the way you feel, what would that word be for you?
Around technology and open source and the community?
Yeah,
And I get one word?
you can cheat.
Hope.
Hope. I don't think we've gotten hope before, so hope is great. I appreciate it. Yeah, and that's the end of our show. Did you have any things you want to follow up with, or things to say at the end?
No, this has been great. Sincerely, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for putting this together and choosing little old me of all people to bring on your show. I appreciate it.
Oh, the humbleness is very, very heartwarming. So thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it. And thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Coffee and Open Source. Take care, everybody.